The elevator lurched. Marcus felt 37 bodies tense around him. The conference room had been bad enough, quarterly projections tanking, investors pulling out, his team looking at him like he might conjure solutions from thin air. Now this. Stuck between floors 14 and 15 with the very people who just watched his company hemorrhage money. His phone buzzed against his chest. Another text from Sarah. The lawyers called again. The fluorescent light flickered overhead. Someone behind him started breathing funny, short, panicked huffs that reminded Marcus of his old dog before thunderstorms. The woman in the corner clutched her purse like it might escape. A man near the buttons jabbed at them repeatedly, each press more desperate than the last. Marcus closed his eyes. 5 years ago, this moment would have killed him. Not literally, though his heart might have tried. He would have been the one hyperventilating, checking his phone compulsively, maybe even calling out sick the next day from the sheer exhaustion of panic. The elevator shuddered again. The huffing behind him accelerated. "Everyone okay?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the building tension like a blade through silk. 36 heads turned. The man at the buttons stopped jabbing. The huffing paused. "Maintenance probably knows already," Marcus continued, checking his watch with the same casual attention he'd give morning coffee. "These systems are monitored. Give it maybe 10 minutes. The truth was simpler, panic was a choice. Not the feeling, that biological hammer strike of adrenaline, the way your nervous system lit up like Christmas morning. But what you did with that feeling, how you let it drive or destroy you, that was where choice lived. Marcus had learned this the expensive way. The woman with the purse relaxed her grip slightly. The man at the buttons stepped back, sheepish. Behind him, the breathing normalized. "You seem pretty calm for someone whose company just," the voice came from his left. Janet Corwin from accounting, her words trailing off when she realized what she was about to say. Marcus smiled. Not the practiced corporate smile he'd perfected over decades, but something smaller, more honest. "Yeah, well, I've had worse days." That was the understatement of his entire adult life. 5 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago, Marcus had been the man hyperventilating in elevators. The man who checked his phone 47 times during lunch meetings. The man who lay awake at 3 a.m. calculating mortgage payments and rehearsing conversations that would never go the way he'd planned them. The man who'd been married to Sarah for 12 years and somehow missed the signs that she'd been done for at least 2. The elevator groaned, settling into stillness. "Tell you what," Marcus said, turning to face the group properly. "While we wait, who wants to hear about the time I lost everything and figured out it was the best thing that ever happened to me?" A pause. The kind that happens when people aren't sure if you're about to have a breakdown or deliver wisdom. "I'm serious," he continued. 5 years ago, I was the guy who would have been leading the panic charge in here. Probably would have tried to pry the doors open with my bare hands by now. The woman with the purse, Linda, he thought her name was, shifted closer. What changed? Marcus considered the question. What changed was everything. What changed was nothing. What changed was the recognition that the thing he'd been running from his entire life wasn't actually chasing him. "I stopped believing my own emergency broadcasts," he said finally. The overhead lights settled into steady illumination. Someone's stomach growled, a sound so ordinary and human that it broke whatever spell of collective anxiety had been building. "See, here's the thing about panic," Marcus continued, his voice finding its rhythm. "It's just your brain trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet." Emphasis on yet. Most of the time, emphasis on doesn't exist at all. Janet leaned against the wall. Easy to say when you're not the one losing everything. "Oh, but I did lose everything." Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with absolute honesty. Wife, house, business, savings, credit, dignity, the full catastrophe. Spent 6 months thinking I was going to die from the stress of it all. Spent another 6 months wishing I would. The elevator was completely quiet now except for the ambient hum of building systems and human breathing. And then I realized something stupid simple. The thing that was killing me wasn't what happened to me. It was how I was reacting to what happened to me. This was the part that sounded like self-help garbage until you lived it. The part that made people think you joined a cult or found religion or started taking experimental medications. The part that was simultaneously the most obvious truth in the world and the most impossible thing to actually believe. Marcus had discovered it on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting in his car outside his lawyer's office after signing papers that dissolved his marriage, his business partnership, and most of his adult identity. He'd been crying not the dignified tears of grief, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of a man who'd run completely out of options. And, in that moment, something had shifted. Not his circumstances. Those were still spectacularly fucked. His wife was still leaving, his business was still failing, his house was still going into foreclosure. But something inside the experience of all that disaster had suddenly felt different. He'd stopped fighting it. Not given up, that was different. Given up was collapse, surrender, the white flag of defeat. This was something else entirely. This was recognition. The way you might recognize that yes, you were indeed in the ocean during a storm, and yes, the waves were enormous and terrifying, but fighting the waves wasn't going to save you. Learning to move with them might. The elevator lurched slightly, then continued its descent. "Huh," said the man who'd been jabbing buttons. "Guess it fixed itself." "They usually do," Marcus replied. The doors opened onto the lobby, and the group filed out with the peculiar awkwardness of people who'd shared an unexpected moment of honesty. Janet lingered for a second. "That thing you said about not believing your own emergency broadcasts?" Marcus nodded. "How do you actually do that?" It was the right question. The only question, really. Because recognizing that your panic was optional was just step one. Step 2 was developing the emotional infrastructure to make that recognition useful. Practice, Marcus said. A lot of practice with smaller emergencies first. Start with traffic jams and work your way up to life implosions. Janet smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she might actually try this. "And, hey," Marcus added as the lobby filled with the usual chaos of people trying to catch late trains and beat traffic, "if you want the full story sometime, I owe you a coffee anyway for covering my ass during the Henderson audit last month." She nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Marcus stood in the lobby for a moment, watching people rush past with the urgent energy of those who believed their emergencies were real and immediate and worth the adrenaline they were burning through. 5 years ago, he would have been right there with them. Now he checked his phone. 3 more texts from Sarah, each one a small masterclass in how to escalate emotional intensity through increasingly creative use of capital letters and punctuation marks. He typed back, "Got stuck in elevator. Home by 7. We can talk then." Simple. Direct. No emotional charge, no defensive energy, no attempt to manage her feelings through his response. This had taken him approximately 18 months to learn. His phone buzzed immediately. Sarah, calling. Marcus looked at the screen for a moment, feeling the familiar pull to answer, to explain, to fix whatever crisis was brewing in her emotional landscape. The old Marcus would have answered on the first ring, would have spent the next 20 minutes trying to talk her down from whatever ledge she'd constructed out of perfectly manageable circumstances. He declined the call and put the phone away. This was not cruelty. This was boundaries. This was the recognition that other people's emotional storms were not his weather to manage. The walk to his car was 15 minutes through downtown traffic, plenty of time to practice what he'd started thinking of as emotional aikido, the art of redirecting energy instead of absorbing it. Every honking horn, every rushed pedestrian, every aggressive driver was a small opportunity to notice his nervous system's impulse to take on the urgency of others and, then, consciously decline the invitation. By the time he reached his car, his phone showed 4 missed calls from Sarah and 6 new texts. The old Marcus would have been physically ill by now. Sweating, nauseous, running through every possible catastrophe that might have prompted this level of communication intensity. The current Marcus started his car, adjusted his mirrors, and drove home at exactly the speed limit. This was what emotional resilience actually looked like in practice. Not the absence of feeling, but the conscious choice about which feelings to amplify and which to let pass through you like weather. The traffic was particularly aggressive today, the kind of Tuesday evening madness that turned normally reasonable humans into barely contained rage machines. Marcus found himself in the middle lane behind a truck that couldn't decide if it wanted to merge left or right, surrounded by cars whose drivers seemed to believe that inches of automotive space were worth risking their lives for. His phone, tucked into the cup holder, lit up with another call from Sarah. For just a moment, Marcus felt the familiar spike of adrenaline. The primitive part of his brain that interpreted repeated calls as evidence of genuine emergency, the part that wanted to answer immediately and absorb whatever crisis she was experiencing until it became his crisis too. He breathed through it. The truck in front of him finally committed to the left lane. A sedan immediately filled the space, its driver glaring at Marcus as if he'd personally been responsible for the delay. This was the work. Not the big moments of crisis where emotional resilience showed up like a superhero to save the day, but these thousands of tiny moments where you got to practice choosing calm over chaos, presence over panic. His exit was coming up. The phone had stopped ringing. Marcus had learned to think of emotional resilience as a muscle that needed regular exercise, not a state of being you achieved once and, then, possessed forever. Every small choice to respond rather than react was a rep in the gym of your own nervous system. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway, which probably meant Sarah had gone to her sister's again. This used to be the kind of detail that would send him spiraling into analysis. What did it mean? What should he do about it? How could he fix it before it became unfixable? Now it was just information. He unlocked the front door and walked into the particular silence of a house where someone had left in anger. Not empty silence, but charged silence, the kind that held the residue of slammed doors and dramatic exits. The kitchen counter was covered with papers, bank statements, legal documents, what looked like real estate listings. Sarah's laptop was open, browser tabs spread across the screen like a digital crime scene of financial research and worst-case scenario planning. Marcus set his keys down and really looked at the scene for the first time. This wasn't crisis. This was someone doing exactly what he'd done 5 years ago, trying to solve problems that hadn't happened yet, trying to control outcomes that were fundamentally uncontrollable, trying to think their way out of uncertainty. The recognition hit him with surprising gentleness. Sarah wasn't the enemy here. Sarah was terrified. Sarah was experiencing what Marcus had experienced before he'd learned that panic was optional, the bone-deep certainty that if you just worried hard enough, planned thoroughly enough, controlled tightly enough, you could prevent disaster. It didn't work. It never worked. But it felt like working right up until it killed you. Marcus made himself a sandwich, poured a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table surrounded by evidence of his wife's beautiful, futile attempt to think her way to safety. His phone rang. This time he answered. Marcus? Sarah's voice was tight with the particular strain that came from hours of escalating anxiety. Where have you been? I've been calling I was stuck in an elevator, he said simply. Then, I drove home. I'm here now. A pause. He could hear her recalibrating, the way people do when they're prepared for drama and get facts instead. The lawyers called about the Henderson contract. They think there might be liability issues with the product defects. And the bank wants to discuss our line of credit. And I found those articles about companies going bankrupt from lawsuits just like Sarah. And I know you think I'm overreacting, but I ran the numbers and if even half of what they're saying is true, we could lose the house, and I already called my sister about whether we could to Sarah. She stopped. Where are you? I'm at Diane's. Okay. Are you safe there? Safe? What do you mean safe? Of course I'm safe, but that's not the point. The point is you're safe right now. In this moment. Tonight. Marcus could hear her breathing change. Not calm exactly, but less jagged. Marcus, we need to talk about this. We need to make plans. We do. And we will. Tomorrow. When we can actually do something about any of it. This was the hardest part of emotional resilience, not just managing your own panic, but refusing to enable other people's. Not in a cruel way, but in the way that healthy boundaries were actually an act of love. I know you're scared, he continued. I know it feels urgent. But nothing we discuss tonight is going to change what the lawyers say tomorrow, or what the bank decides, or whether we keep the house. So we just do nothing? Marcus looked around the kitchen, at the papers scattered like evidence of a crime that hadn't been committed yet, at Sarah's laptop still glowing with browser tabs full of worst-case scenarios. We do nothing about problems that don't exist yet, he said. We get some sleep. We eat breakfast. We handle whatever actually needs handling when we have information instead of imagination. Another pause. Longer this time. When did you become so calm about everything? Sarah's voice had shifted, curiosity replacing some of the urgency. Marcus considered the question. When had he become calm? The answer was both never and constantly. He wasn't calm as a permanent state that was spiritual bypassing, the kind of fake serenity that cracked under any real pressure. He was calm as a practice, calm as a choice he made dozens of times a day. I'm not calm about everything, he said. I'm just not panicked about things I can't control right now. How do you do that? It was the same question Janet had asked in the lobby. The question everyone asked once they realized that emotional resilience wasn't a personality trait you were born with, but a skill you could develop. Practice, Marcus said. A lot of practice with smaller things first. Like what? Like traffic jams. Like elevators getting stuck. Like phones ringing when you can't answer them immediately. He could hear Sarah thinking this over. Will you come get me? She asked finally. Of course. Marcus hung up, gathered the papers from the counter into a neat pile, closed Sarah's laptop, and turned off the lights. The drive to Diane's house was 23 minutes through suburban streets lined with houses where other couples were probably having their own versions of this same conversation, the eternal human struggle between the part of us that wants to prepare for every possible disaster and the part that knows that way lies madness. When Sarah got in the car, she was quieter than he'd expected. I'm sorry about earlier, she said as they pulled out of Diane's driveway. I know I get intense when I'm worried. You don't need to apologize for being worried, Marcus replied. Worry is normal. Worry is human. I just can't fix your worry for you. This had taken him the longest to learn the difference between support and enablement, between empathy and absorption. The old Marcus would have tried to take on Sarah's anxiety until it became his anxiety, would have stayed up all night researching bankruptcy law and calling lawyers and trying to think his way to certainty. The current Marcus could witness her anxiety without needing to fix it. I hate feeling helpless, Sarah said as they stopped at a red light. I know. I hate not knowing what's going to happen. I know. I hate that you're so fucking calm about it. Marcus laughed, not at her, but with recognition. 5 years ago, you would have loved how not calm I was about everything. That's true. Sarah smiled for the first time all day. You were kind of a mess. Kind of? Okay, you were a complete disaster. But it felt like we were in it together. This was the thing about emotional resilience that nobody told you. Sometimes getting healthier made other people feel lonelier. When you stopped participating in collective panic, when you refused to amplify crisis energy, it could feel like abandonment to the people who were used to you being their anxiety processing partner. We are in it together, Marcus said as the light turned green. But now we're in it together from a place of choice instead of desperation. The rest of the drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested thinking rather than brewing conflict. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah turned to him. Will you teach me, she asked. How to do what you do. How to not panic about everything. Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her. The woman he'd been married to for 12 years, who'd stayed with him through his complete emotional collapse and reconstruction, who was brave enough to ask for help instead of pretending she had it all figured out. Yeah, he said. I can do that. This was how part 1 always ended, not with resolution, but with recognition. The moment when someone realizes that emotional resilience isn't about becoming invulnerable, but about learning to work with vulnerability in a way that doesn't destroy you. The moment when panic stops being automatic and becomes optional. The moment when you realize that the man who destroys his weak self isn't eliminating weakness, he's changing his relationship to it. Part 2, The Architecture of Strength. 3 months later, Marcus found himself explaining emotional resilience to a conference room full of skeptical executives who'd hired him to consult on stress management in high-pressure environments. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he'd been the stress case everyone worried about, and now companies were paying him to teach their leadership teams how to stay functional under pressure. Show of hands, Marcus said, looking around the room at 27 faces that ranged from mildly interested to openly dubious. Who here has ever tried to solve a problem by worrying about it really, really hard? Every hand went up. Keep your hand up if it worked. Every hand went down. Right. So we all know intellectually that worry doesn't solve problems, but we keep doing it anyway. Why? The woman at the far end of the table, Jennifer, according to her nameplate, spoke up. Because it feels like we're doing something. Exactly. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like the alternative is just not caring. Marcus walked over to the whiteboard and wrote 3 words: care, worry, action. Here's what most people think their options are, he said, drawing arrows between care and worry, and between worry and action. You care about something, so you worry about it, and worry motivates action. He turned back to the group. But there's a massive problem with this model. Anyone see what it is? A man in his 50s raised his hand. Worry doesn't actually motivate good action. It motivates panic action. Bingo! Worry creates urgency, not clarity. Urgency feels productive, but it's usually counterproductive. Marcus erased the arrow between worry and action and drew a new arrow directly from care to action. What if you could care deeply about something and take action from that caring without the worry step? The skeptical faces were starting to look more curious. Sounds impossible, said Jennifer. It sounds impossible because we've been taught that caring without worrying is not caring enough. That if you're not stressed about something, you must not be taking it seriously. Marcus had learned this lesson through Sarah, actually. 3 months ago, when she'd asked him to teach her emotional resilience, he'd made the mistake of thinking he needed to teach her to care less. To detach. To develop what he'd initially thought of as emotional armor. It had backfired spectacularly. Sarah had interpreted emotional resilience as emotional numbness and had spent 2 weeks trying to not care about anything. The result was a kind of depressive flatness that made Marcus realize he'd been explaining this all wrong. Emotional resilience wasn't about caring less. It was about caring more efficiently. Let me tell you about my wife, Marcus said, settling into the story that had become central to his understanding of how this actually worked. 3 months ago, she was convinced that emotional resilience meant not caring about things. Turns out, that's not resilience, that's emotional shutdown. He moved back to the whiteboard and drew a new diagram. Care, assess, respond. Real emotional resilience looks like this, he said. You care about something deeply, genuinely care. Then, you assess what's actually within your control in this moment. Then, you respond to what you can control and accept what you can't. But, what about the worry? Asked Jennifer. It's not like you can just decide not to worry. You're right. You can't decide not to feel worry. But, you can decide what to do with worry when it shows up. This was where the real work happened. Not in eliminating difficult emotions, but in changing your relationship to them. Marcus had learned this through hundreds of small experiments over the past few years, starting with traffic jams and working his way up to business failures and marriage crises. Worry is information, he continued. It's your brain saying, hey, there's something here that might need attention. The problem isn't the worry itself, it's when we treat worry as if it's an emergency that requires immediate action. One of the younger executives, David, maybe, leaned forward. So what do you do instead? Marcus smiled. This was his favorite part. You interview your worry like a journalist. You ask it questions. What specifically are you worried about? What evidence do you have that this is likely to happen? What could you do if it did happen? What can you do right now that would actually help? He turned back to the whiteboard and wrote, "The worry interview process. What exactly am I worried about? How likely is this to actually happen? What evidence am I using to estimate that likelihood? If it did happen, what would I do? What can I do right now that would actually help?" Most of the time, Marcus said, when you actually interview your worry instead of just feeling it, you discover that either the thing you're worried about is extremely unlikely, or you already know what you'd do if it happened, or there's nothing useful you can do about it right now anyway. Jennifer was taking notes. And this actually works? Let me give you a real example. Last month, my company was facing a potential lawsuit that could have bankrupted us. My first instinct was the old pattern: stay up all night researching bankruptcy law, call lawyers at inappropriate hours, try to control every possible variable. Marcus paused, remembering that night. Sarah had found him at 2 a.m. surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups, trying to read his way to certainty. Instead, I did the worry interview. What exactly was I worried about? Losing the company. How likely was that to happen? We didn't know yet, we were still gathering information. What evidence did I have? Mostly speculation and worst-case scenario articles I'd found online. What would I do if we did lose the company? We'd survive. I'd find another job, we'd adjust our lifestyle, life would continue. What could I do right now that would actually help? Nothing. Our lawyers were handling it, and we wouldn't know anything concrete for another week. So what did you do? I went to bed. Got 8 hours of sleep. Went to work the next day and focused on the things I could actually control, which were all the aspects of running the business that had nothing to do with the lawsuit. The room was quiet in the way that suggested people were actually thinking rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. The lawsuit ended up being dropped 2 weeks later, by the way. Turns out the other party didn't actually have a case, they were just hoping we'd settle out of fear. If I'd spent those 2 weeks in panic mode, I would have made myself miserable for no reason and probably would have made worse decisions about everything else. David raised his hand. But what if the lawsuit had been legitimate? What if you'd actually lost the company? Then, I would have dealt with that when it happened. But worrying about it beforehand wouldn't have changed the outcome, it just would have made me suffer twice. Once in anticipation, and once in reality. This was the concept that took people the longest to really believe, that you could care deeply about outcomes without torturing yourself about outcomes you couldn't control. Marcus moved to a new section of the whiteboard. Let's talk about the difference between preparation and worry, he said, writing both words and drawing a line between them. Preparation is action-oriented. Worry is feeling-oriented. Preparation asks, what can I do to improve my chances of success or reduce my chances of problems? Worry asks, what if everything goes wrong? He turned back to the group. Preparation feels calm and purposeful. Worry feels urgent and chaotic. They're completely different activities, but most people think they're the same thing. Jennifer nodded. I definitely confuse those. Most people do. We've been taught that worry is how responsible people prepare for things. But, actually, worry interferes with preparation because it puts your brain in emergency mode, and emergency mode is terrible for strategic thinking. Marcus had learned this through his business, actually. In the months before everything fell apart 5 years ago, he'd spent enormous amounts of time worrying about the business but almost no time actually preparing for realistic challenges. He'd been so busy catastrophizing about worst-case scenarios that he'd missed the moderate problems he actually could have solved. So how do you prepare without worrying? Asked David. You do scenario planning instead of catastrophic thinking, Marcus replied, moving to a fresh section of the whiteboard. Scenario planning versus catastrophic thinking. Catastrophic thinking, what if everything goes wrong at once? Scenario planning, what are 3 possible outcomes, and what would I do in each case? Catastrophic thinking, what if I can't handle it? Scenario planning: what resources would I need, and how could I get them? Catastrophic thinking: what if it's a disaster? Scenario planning: what would good enough look like, and how could I achieve that? The difference is in the specificity, Marcus continued. Catastrophic thinking deals in vague, overwhelming possibilities. Scenario planning deals in concrete, manageable actions. One of the women in the back, he hadn't caught her name, spoke up. This all makes sense in theory, but what about when you're actually in the middle of a crisis? When everything is falling apart and you need to make decisions quickly? Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with a question he knew how to answer from experience. That's when this stuff becomes most valuable, he said. Because crisis is when your nervous system most wants to default to panic mode, and panic mode makes terrible decisions. He thought about the elevator 3 months ago, about the 37 people who'd been ready to escalate a minor inconvenience into a major crisis, and how easily he'd been able to redirect that energy just by staying calm himself. Here's the thing about actual crises, Marcus said. They require clear thinking and efficient action. Panic interferes with both of those things. So the more intense the situation, the more valuable it is to have practiced staying calm under pressure. But how do you practice that? You start small. You practice with traffic jams and long lines at the grocery store and people being late for meetings. You practice with your internet being slow and your coffee being cold and your plans getting changed at the last minute. Marcus walked around the table, making eye contact with different people as he talked. Every small irritation is an opportunity to practice emotional resilience. Every moment when your first instinct is to get frustrated or anxious or angry, that's a moment when you can choose to respond differently. What does that look like practically? Jennifer asked. It looks like noticing your impulse to react and, then, consciously choosing how to respond instead. It looks like taking a breath before you speak when someone says something that pisses you off. It looks like asking yourself, will this matter in 5 years, when you're stuck in traffic? Marcus paused, remembering his own learning process. For me, it started with elevators, actually. I used to get anxious in elevators, not quite claustrophobic, but definitely uncomfortable. So I started using elevator rides as opportunities to practice calm. Instead of focusing on what could go wrong, I'd focus on my breathing, or I'd look around and notice details about the other people, or I'd use the time to think about something I was grateful for. Did it work? Eventually. But the real benefit wasn't that I stopped being uncomfortable in elevators. The real benefit was that I learned I could be uncomfortable without it being a crisis. I learned that discomfort was just information, not an emergency. This was the foundation of everything else, the recognition that discomfort and danger were not the same thing, that anxiety and emergency were not the same thing, that urgency and importance were not the same thing. Once you learn that at a small scale, Marcus continued, you can apply it to bigger things. Business failures, relationship problems, financial stress, it's all the same basic skill. The ability to feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. David was frowning. But what about situations where urgency is legitimate? Where you actually do need to act quickly? That's exactly when emotional resilience is most valuable, Marcus replied. Because legitimate emergencies require clear thinking and efficient action. If you're in the habit of treating minor inconveniences like emergencies, you won't have any emotional reserves left for actual emergencies. He thought about the difference between his responses to crises now versus 5 years ago. Before, he'd approached every problem with the same level of emotional intensity, whether it was a business crisis or a delayed flight. Now he could calibrate his response to match the actual severity of the situation. It's like physical fitness, Marcus said. If you're in good shape, you can run upstairs without getting winded. If you're not in good shape, running upstairs might leave you exhausted. Emotional resilience works the same way. If you practice staying calm during small stresses, you have more capacity for handling big stresses. So this is really about building emotional stamina, said Jennifer. Exactly. And, just like physical stamina, it requires consistent practice. You can't just decide to be emotionally resilient and, then, have it work automatically. You have to train it. Marcus looked around the room, noting that most people were still engaged rather than checking phones or looking glazed over. This was always the test of whether the material was actually useful or just theoretical. "Who wants to try a practice exercise?" he asked. Several hands went up. "Good. Here's what we're going to do. I want you to think of a situation in your current life that's causing you stress, not something catastrophic, just something that's been bothering you or making you anxious." He gave them a moment to identify something. "Now I want you to run it through the worry interview process. What exactly are you worried about? How likely is it to actually happen? What evidence are you using to estimate that likelihood? What would you do if it did happen? What can you do right now that would actually help?" The room went quiet as people worked through their individual situations. After a few minutes, Marcus asked, "How many of you found that your level of anxiety about the situation decreased when you actually interviewed your worry instead of just feeling it?" Most of the hands went up. "That's the power of getting specific," Marcus said. "Anxiety thrives on vagueness. The more specific you get about what you're actually worried about, the more manageable it becomes." Jennifer raised her hand. "I tried this with a work deadline I've been stressing about, and I realized that I'm actually worried about 3 different things, but only one of them is likely to happen, and I already know how to handle that one." Perfect. That's exactly how this works. When you break down a vague worry into specific concerns, you usually discover that either the concern isn't as likely as it felt, or you already have the resources to handle it, or there's a specific action you can take to address it. Marcus moved back to the center of the room. "This is what I mean when I say that emotional resilience isn't about eliminating difficult emotions, it's about working with them more efficiently." Jennifer still cares about her deadline. She's still motivated to do good work. But she's not wasting emotional energy on anxiety that isn't actually useful. The hour was almost up, but Marcus wanted to leave them with something practical they could start using immediately. "Here's your homework," he said, returning to the whiteboard one more time. "For the next week, every time you notice yourself feeling stressed or anxious about something, practice the worry interview. Get specific about what you're actually concerned about, assess how realistic that concern is, and identify what action, if any, you can take right now." He wrote the 5 questions on the board again. What exactly am I worried about? How likely is this to actually happen? What evidence am I using to estimate that likelihood? If it did happen, what would I do? What can I do right now that would actually help? The goal isn't to eliminate worry, it's to make worry more useful. To transform vague anxiety into specific assessment and targeted action. As people started gathering their things, David approached him. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "Sure. When you were going through your business failure and divorce 5 years ago, were you actually calm during all of that, or did you learn this stuff afterward?" Marcus laughed. "I was a complete disaster. I learned this stuff afterward, through necessity. I had to figure out how to function under pressure because the alternative was falling apart completely." "So you weren't naturally resilient?" "God, no. I was naturally anxious, naturally controlling, naturally convinced that if I worried hard enough I could think my way to safety. This is all learned behavior." David looked relieved. "That's actually encouraging. I was worried you were one of those people who are just naturally calm about everything." "Nope. I'm one of those people who learn to be calm about things through extensive practice with being not calm about things." As the room emptied, Marcus reflected on how strange it was to be teaching skills he'd had to learn through disaster. 5 years ago, he would have been skeptical of someone like himself, someone claiming that emotional resilience was learnable, that panic was optional, that you could care deeply about outcomes without torturing yourself about outcomes you couldn't control. But he'd lived it. He'd gone from being the person who hyperventilated in stuck elevators to being the person who could calm down a room full of panicking people. Not through some mystical transformation, but through thousands of small choices to respond rather than react. The man who destroys his weak self, Marcus had come to understand, doesn't eliminate weakness. He develops a different relationship to weakness. He stops seeing anxiety as evidence of caring and starts seeing it as information to be processed. He stops treating discomfort as emergency and starts treating it as data. This was the architecture of strength, not the absence of vulnerability, but the conscious cultivation of responsibility. The ability to choose how you respond to whatever life presents, regardless of how you initially feel about it. It wasn't magic. It wasn't mysticism. It was practice. Part 3, the practice of becoming unbreakable. 6 months after the corporate workshop, Marcus sat in his home office reviewing case studies from the coaching clients he'd started taking on. Each story was a variation on the same theme: successful, intelligent people who'd built impressive lives but found themselves held hostage by their own nervous systems. Lawyers who couldn't sleep before big cases, executives who made themselves sick with anticipatory anxiety, entrepreneurs who sabotaged their own success through paralytic perfectionism. The latest was Emma, a surgeon who'd contacted him after having a panic attack during a routine procedure. "I've been doing surgery for 15 years, she'd told him during their initial call. "I've never lost a patient, I've never had a serious complication, but lately I can't get through an operation without my hands shaking from anxiety about what might go wrong." Marcus understood. Emma wasn't dealing with incompetence or lack of skill. She was dealing with the accumulated weight of years of carrying responsibility for outcomes she could influence but not fully control. Every surgery carried risk. Every decision carried consequences. And, somewhere along the way, Emma's brain had started treating the normal stress of high-stakes work as if it were an emergency requiring constant vigilance. "Tell me about the last time you felt completely confident during surgery," Marcus had asked. "I don't remember," Emma replied. "Maybe when I was a resident? When I was too inexperienced to really understand everything that could go wrong?" This was the paradox of expertise. The more you knew, the more you understood the variables you couldn't control. Knowledge increased competence but could also increase anxiety if you didn't develop the emotional skills to handle that knowledge wisely. Marcus had seen this pattern in every high-performing client he worked with. Success bred responsibility, responsibility bred pressure, and pressure bred the illusion that anxiety was the price of caring enough to do excellent work. It wasn't. "Emma," Marcus had said, "what if I told you that you could care just as much about patient outcomes while feeling much calmer about the variables you can't control?" "I'd say that sounds impossible." "I know. But, humor me for a minute. What do you actually control during surgery?" "My preparation, my technique, my decision-making, my attention to detail, my communication with the team." "Right. All crucial things. All things you've mastered over 15 years. Now, what don't you control?" "The patient's individual physiology, how they respond to anesthesia, whether they have undiagnosed conditions, whether the equipment works perfectly, whether..." "Okay, stop. Here's the key question. Does worrying about the things you don't control improve your performance on the things you do control?" A long pause. "No. It makes it worse." This was always the breakthrough moment, the recognition that anxiety about uncontrollable variables actually interfered with performance on controllable ones. Now, 3 weeks later, Emma was sending him updates after each surgery. Not because the surgeries were going differently, she was still the same skilled surgeon she'd always been, but because her experience of doing surgery had completely transformed. Day 21, her latest email read: "Performed a complex cardiac procedure today. Noticed my brain trying to spiral about the patient's pre-existing conditions and shut it down immediately. Asked myself, what can I control right now? My focus, my technique, my communication with the team. Spent the entire surgery focused on those things instead of on worst-case scenarios. Patient did great. I felt calm and confident throughout." It's weird how much easier surgery is when you're not fighting your own brain the entire time. Marcus smiled as he filed Emma's update in his growing collection of emotional resilience in practice examples. The truth was, he'd learned as much from his coaching clients as they'd learned from him. Each person's journey through emotional overwhelm to emotional resilience taught him something new about how this process worked, what obstacles people encountered, and what strategies proved most effective. Sarah walked into his office with 2 cups of coffee and the particular expression she wore when she had something she wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about something, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Yeah? Remember when you first started teaching me this stuff, and I thought it meant not caring about things? Marcus nodded. That had been a rough few weeks, watching Sarah try to implement emotional detachment as if it were emotional resilience. I think I understand now why I got that wrong, she continued. I thought the problem was that I cared too much about everything. But, actually, the problem was that I was trying to control everything I cared about. This was exactly right, and it had taken Marcus much longer to figure out than it had taken Sarah. The caring wasn't the problem, she continued. The trying to control outcomes through worry was the problem. What made you realize that? Sarah smiled. The garden. Marcus looked out the window at the vegetable garden Sarah had planted 4 months ago. It had become her primary laboratory for practicing emotional resilience in real time. I used to check on those plants 3 times a day, she said. Measuring growth, adjusting water, researching optimal soil conditions, worrying about pests and whether I'd planted things in the right spots. And, now? Now I check on them once a day. I water them when they need water. I deal with problems when problems arise. But I don't spend my mental energy trying to control how fast they grow or whether we get too much rain or too little sun. Marcus had watched this transformation happen in real time. Sarah had unconsciously used the garden as a way to practice distinguishing between caring and controlling, between attention and anxiety. And the interesting thing is, she continued, the plants are growing just as well. Maybe better, because I'm not constantly disturbing them with unnecessary interventions. How does that translate to the rest of your life? Everything, really. Work projects, relationships, even your business recovery. I still care deeply about outcomes, but I'm not exhausting myself trying to manage variables I can't control. This was the mature version of emotional resilience, not a technique you applied in crisis situations, but a fundamental shift in how you related to uncertainty and responsibility. Marcus's phone rang. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. Emma's on line 1. Says it's urgent. Marcus picked up, immediately shifting into crisis mode until he heard Emma's voice. Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I wanted to call instead of emailing because I don't think I can capture this in writing. Her tone was excited, not distressed. I just finished the most complex surgery I've ever performed. 8 hours, multiple complications, 2 moments where we almost lost the patient. And, the entire time, I felt competent. Present. Clear-headed. Not anxious, not panicked, not overwhelmed. Just focused on doing my job well. Marcus could hear the amazement in her voice. But, here's the thing, I wasn't calm because everything went smoothly. Everything didn't go smoothly. I was calm because when problems arose, I could address them efficiently instead of wasting mental energy on what-if thinking. That's incredible, Emma. It is incredible. But, it's also practical. It's not like I became a different person or developed supernatural powers. I just stopped spending mental energy on things I couldn't control, which freed up that energy for things I could control. After Emma hung up, Sarah looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking about something you said 6 months ago that I didn't understand at the time. Which was? You said that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. I thought you meant becoming invulnerable. But, that's not what you meant, is it? Marcus considered this. It was a phrase he'd started using after his own recovery, but he hadn't examined it as closely as Sarah apparently had. What do you think I meant? I think you meant that when you stop trying to control everything, when you stop believing that anxiety is the price of caring, when you stop treating every problem like a crisis, then external circumstances lose their power to devastate you. She paused, working through the logic. Not because you don't care about external circumstances, but because your well-being isn't dependent on external circumstances going the way you want them to. This was exactly right, though Marcus was impressed that Sarah had articulated it more clearly than he ever had. The weak self, she continued, isn't your capacity for feeling difficult emotions. It's your belief that you can think your way to certainty, that you can worry your way to safety, that you can control outcomes through mental effort. Marcus felt the particular satisfaction that came with being understood at a level he hadn't fully understood himself. So when you destroy that weak self, when you stop trying to manage life through anxiety, you become unbreakable, not because nothing can hurt you, but because you know you can handle whatever does hurt you. That's it exactly. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out at her garden. I wish I'd learned this 20 years ago, she said finally. I know. But maybe 20 years ago we weren't ready to learn it. Maybe we needed to exhaust ourselves with the old way first. This was something Marcus had noticed with all his clients. Emotional resilience seemed to be most available to people who'd already tried everything else. People who'd already worn themselves out with worry, control, and catastrophic thinking. People who'd reached the point where the old ways of handling stress had become more painful than learning new ways. Do you think this stuff can be taught to people before they hit bottom? Sarah asked. Sometimes. But usually people need to experience the cost of emotional reactivity before they're motivated to learn emotional resilience. Like Emma needing to have a panic attack during surgery before she was ready to question whether anxiety was necessary for good performance. Exactly. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from David, the executive from the corporate workshop 6 months ago. Can we schedule a follow-up session? My whole team wants to learn this stuff after seeing how much my decision-making has improved. This was happening more frequently, people wanting to share emotional resilience training with their colleagues, friends, family members. But Marcus had learned to be careful about who he worked with and when. Can I ask you something? Sarah said, interrupting his thoughts. Of course. Are you ever afraid that if you teach too many people this stuff, you'll run out of clients? Marcus laughed. I'm more worried about the opposite problem. Which is? There's an endless supply of people who are exhausting themselves with worry and control. I could work with stressed out high performers for the rest of my life and never run out of clients. That's depressing. Or optimistic, depending on how you look at it. Every person who learns emotional resilience teaches it to others just by modeling it. Emma's going to be calmer during surgeries, which means her surgical teams will be calmer, which means better outcomes for patients. David's going to make better decisions under pressure, which means his team will be less stressed and more effective. Marcus thought about the elevator 6 months ago, about how 37 panicked people had calmed down when one person in the room demonstrated calm. Emotional resilience is contagious, he continued. When you stop participating in collective anxiety, you give other people permission to stop participating in it too. Like how I stopped checking on the garden obsessively because you weren't anxious about whether the vegetables would grow? Exactly like that. Sarah finished her coffee and stood up to leave, then turned back. One more question. Yeah? What's the hardest part of this work for you now? Like, what do you still struggle with? Marcus considered this. What did he still struggle with? Watching other people suffer in ways I used to suffer, knowing I can help, but also knowing they're not always ready to be helped. Like what? Like watching smart, capable people make themselves miserable with preventable anxiety. Like seeing relationships fail because both people are trying to control each other's emotional experiences instead of managing their own. Like working with clients who intellectually understand emotional resilience but can't stop themselves from returning to old patterns when stress gets high. Marcus paused, thinking about the clients who'd made significant progress and then reverted to anxiety and control when faced with unexpected challenges. The hardest part is accepting that I can't rescue people from their own patterns. I can teach skills, I can model different responses, I can support practice, but I can't make people choose resilience over reactivity. But some people do choose it. Some people do. And when they do, it's incredibly rewarding to watch. Emma, for instance. 3 weeks ago she was having panic attacks during surgery. Today she handled an 8-hour emergency procedure with complete calm. That's not just professional development, that's life transformation. After Sarah left, Marcus returned to his case studies. Each one represented someone's journey from emotional reactivity to emotional resilience, from being at the mercy of their nervous system to being able to work with their nervous system skillfully. But, the real value of this work, he'd come to understand, wasn't in the individual transformations. It was in the ripple effects. Every person who learned emotional resilience became a source of calm in their environment. Every surgeon who stopped panicking improved outcomes for patients. Every executive who stopped making decisions from anxiety improved effectiveness for entire teams. Every parent who stopped trying to control their children's emotions modeled healthier relationships for the next generation. Marcus opened his laptop and started typing notes for his next book. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he stops trying to control what is fundamentally uncontrollable. He stops believing that anxiety is the price of caring, that worry is the cost of responsibility, that he can think his way to certainty about an uncertain world. This is not emotional armor. This is emotional fluency. The ability to feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. The ability to care deeply about outcomes without torturing yourself about outcomes you can't control. The ability to respond to crisis from clarity rather than react to crisis from panic. It is learnable. It is practical. It is the difference between surviving your life and actually living it. Marcus saved the file and closed his laptop. Outside, Sarah was in the garden, tending to plants with the relaxed attention of someone who understood the difference between care and control. This was what emotional resilience looked like in practice, not the absence of challenge or uncertainty, but the presence of skills for working with challenge and uncertainty effectively. The phone rang again. Another potential client, another person ready to learn that panic was optional, that anxiety didn't equal caring, that they could handle whatever life presented without exhausting themselves in the process. Marcus answered on the second ring. Marcus speaking. How can I help you? The work continued. The practice deepened. The ripples spread. And, somewhere in a hospital across town, a surgeon prepared for her next procedure with the calm confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her competence without needing to control variables beyond her influence. The man who destroys his weak self doesn't eliminate weakness, he develops mastery over his relationship to it. This was the practice of becoming unbreakable. End of document.